organizing your Valentine's Day celebrations for this. That was really good. My name is Donna Wojcik, and I'm the research archivist here at the Farm and Ranch Museum, and I've been a part of the museum's oral history program since 1998. Over the past 20 years, the museum has been fortunate to be involved in oral history projects with other institutions. Our role in each of these projects has been what is considered to be the most tedious and time-consuming part of any oral history program, and that is to create a typed transcript and abstract for each of the interviews. And it is certainly our pleasure to be part of this collaborative project within MSU. Kelly Jenks is an historical archaeologist with a focus on Hispanic colonization and settlement in New Mexico. Mary Alice Scott is a cultural anthropologist specializing in medical anthropology with a focus on how people conceptualize and manage their health. Both are co-directors of the New Mexico Rural Heritage Oral History Project, a project that is supported by the New Mexico Humanities Council, NMSU, and the Farm and Ranch Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kelly Jenks and Dr. Mary Alice Scott.
I've been advised to make sure everybody can hear me. I love microphones. I'm so pleased, you guys. I'm delighted that y'all have come here to join us on Valentine's Day night. Kind of an awkward run. To hear us talk about this project. So my name is Kelly Jenks. This is my colleague Mary Alice Scott. We're going to be playing sort of a rotation going through this talk. And I want to also thank Donna for introducing us and for her incredible work on this project. She's been a fabulous resource since I came to New Mexico State in 2015 on giving us advice on sort of ways to do oral history, letting us see the library, letting us see the transcripts, and sort of how the program here has actually curated these oral histories, which are a tremendous resource, and I'm so excited to be collaborating, and I'm so excited that they're doing the tedious, time-consuming work of transcription and abstracts. Really excited about that. So I wanted to go ahead, I'm sure this is working, to welcome you to hear about our project, and this is, the title of the talk is Remembering Life in Rural New Mexico. And the name of our project is the New Mexican Rural Heritage Oral History Project. And I'm realizing as I'm talking to you on Valentine's Day that we will be sharing with you the romance, I have to highlight romance, of living in rural New Mexico and battling rattlesnakes and talking about outhouses. So thank you for joining us on such a romantic occasion. I also want to introduce briefly, so while this project is a collaboration between me and Mary Alice Scott, I also need to acknowledge, standing in the back, Mariah Ballard. Wave, Mariah. Mariah is our research assistant. Thank you. Really, she's been tireless. She's been working with us throughout this project. She is going to be continuing to work with these interviews. She's the person who edited all the sound clips we're going to be playing tonight. She's a tremendous resource. I also want to acknowledge Kayla Brown, who's ill tonight, but is another research assistant with our project. We are a team. We've been working through this all together, and it's with their help that we can do this. So, as Donna said, I'm an archaeologist. Mary Alice is a medical anthropologist. We might seem like odd people to be talking about oral history, but we both really like history. We both actually have a rural background, Arkansas and Texas. Yeah. And we both ask a lot of questions that tend not to appear in the big published histories. So, for example, me, I want to know where the toilets are. I want to know where people throw out their stuff, right? I spend all my time looking at the ruins of isolated ranches and rural communities. And And Mary Alice also, we want to know how people were treating the many different illnesses and injuries they sustained in these contexts. How do they think about health? How were they treating these conditions? And that has been some of the best kind of information that we've learned through this project, and it's one of the things that we're going to highlight today. So we have in this project, we started collecting interviews last summer, and we've collected 27 interviews total. Today we're actually going to be highlighting a portion of these, particularly samples from Kay Burr, Claude Leyendecker, Grady McCullough, Jerry Navarez, Billy Poindexter, Jerry Saunders, and Monty Shriver. Several of these individuals are with us today, and we thank them for joining us. These are individuals who either lived in this part of the state, southern New Mexico, southern central New Mexico, or live here now. And so we wanted to especially highlight their stories. And we want to let you guys know, and we'll come back to this at the end, that the transcripts and abstracts, as well as the recordings, will be curated here. So our idea in having this presentation is really about introducing you to the kinds of things that are in these stories, and encouraging you to come see them, to come listen to them, and to know that they're here. We have our usual disclaimer. The Humanities Council claims no responsibility for what we tell you about outhouses. Okay, so this is a map put together by Mariah. Each of those blue dots is a place that was mentioned by one of the people who gave us these interviews, a place where they grew up, and the stories that they're telling are coming from those places. So we tried to cover as much of the state as we could. In the short time we had for this project, the purple spots are where we actually had several different people from that area, so we have several stories from that area. So to give you a sense of the coverage of the project. And in order to talk to you today, these interviews cover topics about daily life that range from kind of the nature of the household, farming, health. They cover a wide variety of topics. We're focusing on a few key themes. So we're going to be talking about education, about health and healing, religion, daily life, and then finishing up with some local perspectives on some big events in history. I'll also say I've got pictures that I'm bringing in to illustrate these talks, since we're mostly going to be playing sound clips. Those pictures may or may not have anything to do with the actual sound clip, but they're meant to be still interesting. Apologies on that one. When I could, when they were provided by people who participated, I've got those up here. So to begin with education, and just to let you know, this talk is mostly giving us a chance to play sound clips, and so I'm going to be waving each time I want to play a clip. So an important part of growing up in rural New Mexico is, of course, education, and especially figuring out how to get to school and figuring out how to get that education could be complicated when you lived in a pretty rural, spread out place, right? There were, in really rural areas, not that many people, a whole lot of space, and so trying to figure out how to get enough children together to make a class, to fill a school could be a real challenge. And then also to get people to and from school could be another major challenge. There were a lot of reasons that people had to travel far distances to get to school, and there were a lot of reasons that kids were not always able to attend, whether that was having to participate in the harvest, whether it was ill health, whether it was bad roads. So the first clip I have here is by Billy Poindexter, and he's talking about the challenges of attending school in the small community of Pilar, New Mexico.
Well, in Pilar, we went to school, and the schoolhouse was an old church. Mm-hmm. There was 8 grades in one room.
Oh, wow.
You imagine how much education we got.
Was there one teacher?
Huh?
One teacher?
One teacher.
Wow.
And
so just kind of from the outset, we have the possibility of 8 classes, 8 different grades in one room with one teacher, and the quality education. I'm sure that teacher strove to, I'm challenged enough with one class of college students. We also have on this next clip Billy talking about the process of getting to school. He talked a lot about how in rural communities, sometimes the schools couldn't even afford to have school buses to get the children to school, so that wasn't always even an option. When you did have to go to school, you may have to walk quite a distance to get to the bus to take you to school, and he has a kind of harrowing adventure story there too.
We had to walk a mile to catch the school bus, and we walked back one afternoon. I was walking up the boar pit. You know what a boar pit is? It's on each side of the road where they can borrow dirt to make the road.
Oh, okay.
And I think something crawled down in there. I wish I picked it up. It had a big head and body about that long. I couldn't figure out what it was. I looked at that, it opened its mouth and had two fangs.
Oh,
It was a baby brown snake.
you picked it up.
And I picked it up. And I was very lucky it didn't bite me.
Mm-hmm.
Gotta love the New Mexico stories, right? One of the things you can do on your way to school is try not to die from a rattlesnake bite. So not everybody finished high school, and those that did oftentimes went straight to work or straight to work on the farm. But some people were able to continue their education. And for people who were living in this part of the state, I promise you we're not paid by NMSU to say this, but NMSU, New Mexico State University, oftentimes was the preferred choice. At that time, New Mexico A&M. So in this clip, Jerry Saunders talks about growing up. She lived in university housing because her father was attending the university and he was also working at the NMSU dairy.
Okay.
And that was very close to the dairy farm barns because that's where my dad was working
Okay.
in the dairy.
Okay.
Because at that point it was, and they provided milk, to the town,
Okay.
partially.
Wow. No. It's working dairy there.
I thought it was exciting that we still had livestock on campus. I had no idea that it was once a working dairy. We also have a story from Kay Byrne. She talked about coming to college here at NMSU. She was living initially in Hot Springs, what's now Truth or Consequences, TRC, and she stunned our research assistants, particularly in her description of not just university life in the 1940s, but the tuition.
Time for me to go to college. On the train. The tuition was $28 a semester.
Wow.
For all the hours you wanted.
Wow.
And when the new women's dorm had just been built, it was two parts, Rhodes Hall and Garrett Hall. And they were up this way. You know where they are, don't you?
Mm-hmm. You were here but it was it
Yeah.
NMSU?
Yeah, in MSU.
But was it NMSU at that time?
No, it was A&M.
Okay. Yeah. Then I know where you're
Yeah.
talking about.
They had just opened, brand new, really nice. And where they stopped, there was nothing but desert out here. There was nothing east of those things. Okay, that's where we lived. But to eat, we had to go all the way down to, where the jewelry store is, the Cutter's Jewelry. Well, across the street from Cutter's Jewelry was a temporary building. That was what do they call them? They have a name for those, barracks, I guess.
Okay.
Or something. That was the dining hall.
Okay.
So we had to go and walk. Nobody had a car. Nobody. And we had to walk all the way down there. And we ate on big tables with family-style meals.
Okay, so we also want to talk a little bit about health and healing, which is my favorite topic. And what we learned about health and healing focused largely on accessibility to what we would call allopathic or Western medicine physicians, clinics, and hospitals, but also the home remedies that people use to treat a variety of health concerns. And although pregnancy and birth is not an illness, I'd like to point out, we were also interested in how people attended to labor and birth in rural communities. So we have a couple of, or one story about that we're going to share tonight. And several interviewees also discussed their experiences with what were at the time relatively common illnesses that we no longer see on a regular basis, like measles. So we have a few stories about that. We're not sharing tonight, but that are in the oral histories if you're interested in hearing about those. So in the first clip, Jerry Navarez describes a few of the home remedies that his mother used when he was growing up in the early 1950s in La Mesa. He also mentions that allopathic physicians were not the only option for treatment of illness. People might also seek assistance from curanderas, or traditional healers, in the community.
It was interesting. I still remember that for headaches, my mother would slice a potato, raw potato, with vinegar, and then with a handkerchief, she would put it on your head to kind of cure a headache. I don't know if that really works or not. Different things for your teeth or gum problems and things that I still don't remember exactly what was being used. For fever. And again, these are things that I saw basically, but the tomato, a raw tomato, put in oil and water, smashed up, put in a towel, and put it on the bottom of your feet, supposedly to draw out the fever. So it just depends. There were also people that were called curanderas that people would go to. They would do different things.
Okay.
So either took care of it that way, or try to make it to a doctor.
Okay. All right. Okay, has anybody heard of black draught? I learned what this was in the process of doing these oral histories. So in the next clip that we're going to share, Billy Poindexter tells us about a patent remedy called black draught, which is, I learned, a liquid syrup laxative made from senna and magnesia that was commonly used when he was growing up in the 1930s and 1940s, and it does not sound like a very pleasant cure to me. See what you think.
So we need to know what doctor was with black dog. You know what black dog is? You don't want to know.
Okay.
It's a kind of a powder like snuff,
Okay.
and you take it, and then you set on 2 over all night.
Right, so the two-holer, thus the image there, right? I guess it worked, I don't know.
Let me see the powder was there. It's a little hard, maybe you could.
Yeah, so the powder is, it's a black powder that's actually made from senna and magnesia. So, yeah.
I don't like snuff, but it works on the other end.
Yes. Okay. And this is Billy, by the way, in the front row, who told us this story. We learned this story from. Okay, so other than medicines that kept you on the two-holer all night, rural life also came with other dangers, as Grady McCullough tells us in this story about the time he fell asleep on a go-devil while his father was plowing the fields in their family homestead in House, New Mexico, out on the Llano Estacado. And I also didn't know what a go-devil was, but I have learned that this is a go-devil. Is it playing?
When I was, must have been about 4, I was
sitting on what we call the go devil. It's a sled with knives on the side, but at the back you have 3 discs on each side that after the knives cut the weeds in the bed, you went down the sled, went right down the furrow and straddling your crop. Then the disc pulled the dirt in on the crop to cultivate it. And I had caught a baby rabbit, was sitting on the seat of the cultivator, warm morning in summer, and evidently I was half asleep and fell off. And my dad fortunately looked back and as he saw me fall and stop in the team, he stepped the opposite direction that he was standing on the wings of the platform on. And he stepped to the left side to lift the weight off so that it lifted the disc over. But the disc went here, across here, and across my leg. I bore scars of that. They pretty well disappeared in the 90 years since. But
And what did you do during that time? Was there a hospital, or what did you do when something like that happened?
Fortunately, my mother had nurses training, was an LPN, and she took care of it with home remedies.
Okay.
Impressive that home remedies can take care of injuries like that. And thank you, Mr. McCullough, for sharing that story with us. He's in the audience tonight, too. And then the last little clip that I want to share, just because I want to focus just a little bit on the midwives. We did hear some stories about midwives working in rural communities. This is a short story from Claude Leyendecker about the high-quality care that midwives provided around Deming in the early 1940s. Oh, whoops, sorry.
There were lots of midwives, lots of midwives. His Hispanic community had lots and lots of midwives, and they were good. I mean, they had delivered as many babies as many of the MPs in those days.
I also just want to weigh in. One of the clips that we don't have from Billy Poindexter's interview is also talking about his parents, after the first few kids, got pretty good at it, and so they didn't go have anybody help. So midwife is sometimes the luxury, which is horrifying for me to contemplate. So the next thing we wanted to talk about is religion. And of course, not everybody living, one of the interesting things in these interviews is, not everybody living in rural New Mexico, even in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, was religious. And not everybody who was religious lived close enough to a town that they actually got to regularly attend a church or be part of a congregation. But for many people, religion was an important part of daily life, an important part of the community. And one of the things that was really interesting to hear is how the different kind of religious organizations, different churches, really were competing for followers in this sort of wide space with not too many people. So in this clip, Mr. McCullough remembers how several of the small congregations in his area worked out a schedule to share the same meeting place.
As a memory again, our place was one of about 3 in the community that the kids gathered on Sunday afternoon. We had a community Sunday school and church in the schoolhouse, and the Methodist preacher preacher preached on the first and third Sunday, and the Baptist on the second and fourth, and the Church of Christ on the fifth Sunday.
And I know the crucifix isn't entirely the right, it's an artifact from southern New Mexico though, so brought it in. Another clip that we have here, kind of relating to the thing, some of the challenges of having a small congregation. In this clip, Kay Bird remembers being asked to serve as an altar boy in her Episcopalian church because it had such a small congregation back when she was living in Hot Springs, which is now TRC, and some of the things that she was asked to do when she did that.
There was a very small a membership in the church, very small congregation, and the friar needed altar boys. Well, there weren't enough boys, so my sister and I were inducted. We were probably 7 and 8 years old, and we were also called altar boys. They pretended that we were girls, I guess, and we wore long black skirt for the services, long black skirts, and white surplices, is that what it's called? Was lace at the bottom, and we would usually just stand and look holy or something. And I remember once the friar conscripted, as he called him. I guess we had a phone then, I think. Anyway, he called my mother and said we were needed at the church for a service. So she sent us, and the service was a funeral for a little girl who had died at Carrie Tingley Hospital. And we, the altar boys, we had to wear our outfits and stand around the coffin. And I happened to be at the head of the coffin. And we were very uncomfortable. It was hot. It was miserably hot. And we were perspiring. And the incense made me kind of sick. The friar was very formal with everything. And there was incense, and I was standing there, and a fly landed on her face. She was a beautiful little girl with long blonde curls, and she was dressed in a beautiful pink dress, and the coffin was lined with white satin, and I thought all that was very beautiful. But this fly was falling on her face, and I was standing there, and I just couldn't stand it anymore. It crawled up her nose, and then it crawled out. I was going to pieces, and so finally I went like that, and the friar glared at me. So and at that time, everyone was scared to death of polio. I mean, everybody was scared to death. We didn't know how it was spread. And my mother would have been really unhappy to know that we were called to that funeral because everyone was superstitious about polio. But anyway, I went home and vomited, and I told my mother that I just kind of felt sick or something.
So the Carrie Tingley Hospital, that particular one was in Hot Springs, now in TRC, and it was for disabled children. It was open at the time. So you had, funerals were one type of religious celebration or rite that brings a lot of the community together. You also had potlucks. Came up a lot in the interviews as everything being about the potluck, and religious processions, and all of these are kind of bringing people together who live pretty spread out a lot of the time. And in this next clip from Jerry Navarez, who grew up in the 50s and 60s in La Mesa, kind of down south of Las Cruces, he talks about remembering what it was like to participate in the celebration of San Isidro, who's the patron saint of farmers. He actually mentioned being really pleased that the Farm Ranch Heritage Museum still does this because they've stopped doing this down in La Mesa.
The bend in this house over to our farmers. So so that you have to get processions in the fields. It was quite an event. And then it ended back in the church.
Okay. And what did they do when they stopped at each house?
Well, it was mostly, they would have a prayer service, a lot of interaction. I guess, and then in some places they would serve, like, you know, chocolate or the Vietnamese.
Okay, so we also want to talk a little bit tonight about just some other aspects of daily life. And I mean, you all are all well aware that daily life is quite different in rural New Mexico in the 30s, 40s, and 50s from rural life today. And while we already knew generally that many people didn't have electricity, running water, motorized vehicles, and other things that we would now consider just common everyday, not even luxuries, we were interested in hearing people's stories about daily living in that world. And these are the kinds of details that might not show up in history books, and it's part of why we were interested in doing these oral histories. So we wanted to share a few clips of people talking a little bit about what it was like to live without electricity or running water or those kinds of things. So in this first clip, Monty Schreiber describes how his family in Aztec, New Mexico got drinking water into their home, which was much more complicated than what I do, which is turning on the tap, and you will hear me be surprised in this clip, I think.
What I remember about growing up was we had a cistern. Oh, we had an outhouse, of course.
Okay.
And we had a cistern, and we had I'd say, a filtration system.
Okay.
Where they run the ditch water through two, how do I draw this? It was like, as I remember, something like this. Two chambers filled with rocks. And then run the ditch water through this. Mm-hmm. And then it would go into the cistern, and then we'd add chlorine to it.
Okay.
Because I remember then we had a bucket that my dad would go out and just on a rope and drop it down and fill it up with water.
Wow.
And bring it in and it would sit, I remember, in the house. And there was a little cup there, and we'd go, I had to stand on a stool, of course, mm-hmm. to take the cup and get a drink of the water.
Yeah.
And then whenever it was empty, went out and filled it. My dad filled it up again.
So a slightly more complicated way of getting drinking water. Okay. It was also a little more challenging to stay warm in the winter. And Grady McCullough talked to us about how his family kept their house in House, New Mexico, warm in the winter, which was also surprising to me.
Part where we had heater was always fun, keeping it going during the winter, which was one of another interesting jobs was picking up cow chips. Because just like the early settlers picked up as they were moving along, they'd pick up buffalo chips and toss them under the wagon. Well, on a weekend we'd go out and one weekend and gather cow chips and pile them in piles, and then the next weekend we'd go out with a wagon, bring in a wagon load of cow chips. To give a little substance to those instead of just hauling out ashes all the time. We also went to the breaks, the edge of the cap rock, and got juniper and mesquite grubs to add as fuel to keep us warm. And then we'd add a little coal. We'd drop a piece of coal in, particularly in the cook stove in the kitchen for longer burning substantial heat, because the cow chips was real hot and then
So Kelly just whispered to me that we have a little bit to learn about renewable energy from our from these oral histories. so we also learned some about wild foods that people collected. And in this clip, Jerry Navarez talks about the wild foods that he collected around his home in La Mesa that were a really regular part of their diet. And they're wild plants that you all may still be familiar with, but we've learned, Kelly told me that they don't grow as much in these areas anymore because of the amount of herbicides that are used in farming around here. So it's harder to find these plants today.
Well, we would have, now they're called weeds, but there's something called purslane, which we call it verdolagas. Those are plentiful in the farm, so we collect those for food.
Okay.
And which are lamb's quarters.
Okay.
Those two. We had cactus, which I have some still from the farm. You saw who walked in the house. Those are cuttings. They're originally from the original plant on the farm.
Oh, okay.
Those are harvested during the growing season, and you can cook those up.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
All right.
Asparagus used to grow wild in the ditches, so I used to go out and harvest the asparagus.
Yeah.
It's not anymore because farmers use herbicides, and back then nobody was using herbicides.
You mentioned some of the things we talked about.
Sure, yeah, it's a little hard to hear. So he talked about purslane, verdolagas.
And what do they do with that?
So that's Kelly, you probably know more about this than I do. And also the quelites, which is lamb's quarter, I believe, spinach. So they cook it down like spinach. So these are greens that grow wild, and in fact, it's not just in New Mexico. You find this in other places too. These are edible greens, just like dandelions, which are edible greens, but we think of them as weeds. And so you collect them and you cook them down just like spinach.
There's a wild weeds.
Lamb's quarter, the wild weed. It's a wild weed called lamb's quarter. Yeah, you eat a lot of that.
Yes, but it's called
So, and he's giving some of the terms in both. So, like I worked in partially northern New Mexico, so in Spanish it's quelites, and there's still some restaurants where they'll have quelites in the menu, and it can mean spinach, but that's oftentimes what they would use. But in English it's lamb's quarters. All right, so we also, in addition to learning about renewable energy, we learned about some original farm-to-table methods. So now, farm-to-table restaurants are really quite trendy, but this looked really different in the 1930s and 1940s. So in the next clip, Grady McCullough describes what I think could be potentially the original farm-to-table concept around House, New Mexico.
The Dust Bowl during the Depression, as I say, I didn't know we were poor because everybody was in the same boat, and we were very fortunate in that we grew our own crops for both wheat, corn, and we would always make a turnip patch late in the fall and put turnips underground to keep them during the winter, and in the corn strip of cornfield we'd also plant pumpkins and squash and watermelons down through that, and so we had food. Mama put up 800 to 1,000 quarts of food during the summer and canning, and then have that from the cellar along with meat. We shared generally with about 3 other families that had joined us, and we'd each fatten out a calf to butcher. We didn't have any means of refrigeration then, so first frost, we'd butcher one of the calves, divide it up, each taking a quarter, and then about a month later we'd butcher another one, and this way each one taking a quarter. That So this was, butchering day was always a big time with the neighbors coming and butchering either beef or hogs. We generally butchered about either two or three hogs and then we would salt down, cure the hams and shoulders, bacon, the trimmings and all we'd make into sausage and either pack it in bags to hang in the smokehouse or else fry it down and put it in crocks in the cellar and to keep it till we used it.
All right, so we learned about canning from a number of different people about how you dealt with large amounts of meat that you couldn't store easily. So sharing with other people was really common, but also drying meat and storing it, salting it, storing it, frying it, and storing it in crocks in the cellar. So these are things that were kind of familiar to me. Growing up, we also did a lot of canning, but we also had a deep freeze, and so all the meat went straight in the deep freeze, which sounds a whole lot easier than what was happening in the 30s and 40s. And so, speaking of refrigeration, we also learned a lot about many ways to keep things cool if you don't have a refrigerator. And so in this clip, Claude Leyendecker tells us about how his family kept things cool and kept them from spoiling before they had refrigeration in his home near Deming.
To keep things cool, we used ice when it was available, but when you say our daily needs, if we couldn't get ice, we had spoilies. There's no doubt about it. Everybody had spoilies to a degree. My mother had some type of cooler in the window that was where the cool air on the north side of the house, where the cool air would circulate.
So, in case that wasn't terribly clear, he talks about having a window box set up on the north side of the house because there's less sun on the north side of the house, right? The sun is more on the south side, so it's the coolest side of the house, and by having a box out the window with like a cloth over the top, on top of damp cloth, you get that evaporative cooling. I was so excited, probably embarrassingly excited to see, because I've heard about these things, I understand the concept, I don't see them. I haven't ever seen them in action, and like I said, as an archaeologist, I always kind of want to know what they look like, and I don't know if any of you would have been watching Netflix TV shows. There's a new show, something or another, Miss Maisel, Marvelous Miss Maisel. At some point, her mother goes to France, and it's in an upstairs of a boarding house, and she gets some butter, and she puts it in the window box, and I about lost my mind, and my husband thought I was insane. So one of the things, this is the last thing we're going to talk about before kind of turning it over and talking to the audience. One of the things that's really exciting to me about oral history, in addition to the window box units, is that there's so much of everyday life that doesn't oftentimes get written down or talked about because nobody thinks it's important enough to kind of record, right? And that's a lot of what I'm actually most interested in. But there's also a lot of the kind of big stories, big history, our elections and wars, that we have a sense of the big narrative, but maybe not a sense of how it would have actually been to live through it, right? What everyday kind of life in those times would have been like. And so this last section is about getting these little kind of windows into some of these big events, how they affected the people who we were talking to. So this first clip is about the Great Depression, and this is from Kay Bird, who, like I said, is living in Hot Springs and talking about what it was like living as a child during the Great Depression.
And I remember men coming to our back door and asking to travel on, you know, but I remember a constant stream of that during the Depression.
Mrs. Bird, one of the things, part of her New Mexican origin story was her grandfather was I believe, the superintendent of construction of Elephant Butte Dam. So her family had already been in the area, her mother's father was already in the area, and so they had some more resources during this time when so many people were struggling so much, and there were people constantly coming through. Going back out onto the Llano Estacado and cow chip territory, we also have Grady McCullough talking about what it was like during the Dust Bowl up on that portion of the Southern Plains.
Llano Estacado itself, my father, when he went there first in 1907, it was truly a staked plain. You had to put up stakes to know where you'd been and where to find your way back, because the grass was up to the horse's belly. And it's flat as a pancake, 5,000 foot altitude there. And as I say, the family, 5 of us kids, growing up in a little 3-room house in a T-shaped box house during the Dust Bowl, and we'd go in with scoops in the number 3 tub to clean up the sand as the wind quit blowing at sunset.
I almost put a picture of a number 3 tub. How many of you know what that looks like? Yeah. So it's a galvanized bucket. So for my students in the back, it's a galvanized bucket about 24 inches, I think, in diameter. They're about a little less than a foot deep. And it's one of the, you see washing oftentimes. It's also used for very luxurious bathing, right? So that's kind of what you're squeezing up dust into from each day in the Dust Bowl. So I also have a story back to Cape Bird up in Hot Springs talking about the CCC. So there are different CCC camps throughout New Mexico, and there was one relatively near where she lived, around Elephant Butte, where they were working on, I'm pretty sure this is the one that she was talking about, where they were working on building these casitas, which are apparently now still available to, you can go rent and stay there. But she talked about what it was like to go visit them, and also sort of what those camps were like for the men who were able to come out and work.
You know, those CCC camps were just wonderful, what they did. They took mostly boys from the East who had never, hardly ever been out, even outside. You know, they lived in tenements and places, and they put them to work. They did a lot of work up at Elephant Butte Dam, and all kinds of work. And they became strong and healthy. They were a sickly, frail bunch when they got there. And it's a good thing they did, because the next thing they had to do was fight a war.
Which leads us to World War II. The next thing, we had a lot of stories about World War II, World War II era. The first one, this first clip I have here, is Claude Landecker talking about coming from Deming to start at NMSU and quickly ending up switching over to joining what was then called the Air Corps.
I started at New Mexico A&M in the summer of 1942.
Okay.
And I didn't have that. It was a summer semester, I remember. And that was when 1942 is when World War II was beginning and getting into its various phases. And the college had an ROTC program, but it took whatever, 2, 3, or 4 years to make it through their program, and the war was now. So a bunch of the farm boys and ranch boys that I knew joined the active services that were facing the enemy at that time. And I wasn't doing too good in college, that's for sure. So I joined what was called then the Air Corps. It's since I guess it's made it sound a little stronger and a little larger. They changed the name of the United States Air Force.
So that's what you're doing? I guess I could direct this to my students. If you're not doing very well in school, here's an option. And I also just have to say, we didn't collect pictures from everybody. It was only if they had them on hand and if they wanted to share them, but I wanted to have some pictures on here. So I also had the fun of going through my sort of family picture collections. And this is my grandfather, who was also in the Air Force, and this is also from 1942. This is also from my grandfather. So then another story that we have that's about the same time period, also in MSU, also sort of 41, 42, comes from Jerry Saunders. She's the woman who's lived in family housing on campus because her father was going to school here and he got called up. And so she talks about what it was like for the family to try to go follow to see their father.
And then he was called up to active duty, because that would have been 40. I don't know whether it was 41 or 42. I could probably figure that out, but it would take a little digging. And because he'd been in ROTC, and he was a lieutenant or something, and we went to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. He went first. And then, because of gas rationing, my mom and another wife, whose husband was also in the same group as my dad, they pooled their gas ration tickets and filled in the back of a big old Chevy 4-door car, filled in the back of the seat up to the same level as the seat, made beds there, and they drove themselves and their kids to Fort Sill to join the dads there.
So they pulled their gas ration card so that they could caravan up. I thought it was great to be thinking about sort of the family left behind and the way that they would try to see each other whenever they could. I mentioned going through the family gear and finding a lot of things my grandmother had kept, and letters and things to remember my grandfather. But another thing I thought was really great with this picture, this is part of his uniform, his dog tags. This closes and it's a military button and it opens and it has a picture of his mother on one side and his father on another. Because so many of these people going were so young and they're taking pictures of family with them too. Another story we have, this comes from Auntie Shriver. He was young, living as a kid in Aztec, New Mexico. We actually heard a similar story from Jerry Navarez, who was down in La Mesa, and they were talking about blackouts, so practicing with the idea that the Japanese might come over and might attack, and so you wanted to keep everything dark at night so they couldn't see where your settlement was to attack. And this was kind of commonly known and a more widespread practice on the Pacific coast. But they're talking about this in both kind of the northern end and the southern end of New Mexico.
But I know we had blackouts. They would practice a blackout in Aztec.
Okay.
And you could hear the plane might fly over, but the lights, of course, all our lights are, that's the big thing, to have blackouts.
Okay.
It's a blackout.
Yeah. And so here we have another clip. This is by Jerry Saunders again, talking specifically about the ration coupon books. And this is an excerpt from a book of poems she wrote about growing up.
During the war, when we lived with ration coupons, sugar and chocolate were two things it was hard to get. I can remember looking in the window at one of the cafes on Main Street, this is Wisconsin, at the display of a few Hershey bars that they had obtained somehow. We were not allowed to have them because they took too many coupons. But oh, how we craved them when we couldn't have them. And chewing gum was the same way. There were times you wanted to kill the first stick of juicy fruit. You also needed coupons for shoes, gas, and other items that were considered vital to the war effort.
One of the things that Jerry Navarez mentioned was actually them providing gas coupons for people who were farming and putting coloring in the gas so that they would know that you were using it right. We also had a story, we don't have audio, but we wanted to mention, so that you can best learn about it later, that Billy Poindexter had a story too about fighting the fire in the Capitol Mountains when they rescued Smokey Bear. So Smokey Bear, that tells you not to start forest fires, was a real bear that was rescued from a forest fire here in New Mexico in 1950 in the spring. And Mr. Poindexter was actually there to see this photograph get taken.
Yeah, the pilot's Ray Bell.
Who was the pilot?
Ray Bell.
Ray Bell?
Yes.
Okay. See, I'll come back to that. So the last story that we had a clip of comes from Jerry Navarez again, and this is our 1960 in the election of JFK, and he talks about how it was down in La Mesa.
One of the other big events that I remember growing up was the 1960 election.
Oh, yeah.
Because John Kennedy was a Catholic. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of support in the Hispanic community, the Mexican American community for that. And I remember election night, my father, because he had devotions for different saints, so he had St. Anthony, and he lit a candle on that night, the election night, hoping that Kennedy would win. So I remember that.
Yeah. Do you remember what happened in your community when he did win?
Well, like I said, he had tremendous support.
Yeah.
When he won the election, and I don't know if you heard it from other people, but in every house there was a picture of Jesus Christ and a picture of John F. Kennedy. And the Pope, they could get one. Even sometimes the Pope, they had a picture of John F. Kennedy.
Just to reiterate, because the sound quality is a little iffy at the end, he says everybody's house would have a picture of Jesus Christ, JFK, and maybe the Pope. Okay, so what we... Okay, so what we presented today is just a really small sample of the stories that we heard from our participants, and we focused on just a small number even of the participants that we have in this whole project. So as we mentioned at the beginning, there are 27 interviews that we've done with people around the state, and so we really invite you to come back to the Farm and Ranch Museum to listen to the full audio recordings of each of our interviews that will be available.